I spent 90 hours without my phone, and I wanted to record this video as a way to help other people if they wanted to take a similar trip, as well as go through some learnings and reflections. Welcome to episode 397 of this podcast. And I figured this would be a way for me to recap the journey in some way. So I asked Twitter for some questions. I'm going to go over a couple of them before I even started the trip. Then I'm going to talk about what did I really learn from doing this? What were my immediate thoughts? What books did I read? What did I learn from those books? And what are some lessons that I learned about myself? I'm going to go through that list. If you're watching on YouTube, drop a like, a comment, a subscribe. That would mean the world. That would really help grow the channel. I'm making a big focus on YouTube in 2023 and the rest of 2023. And this podcast is mostly interviews. And I intend to keep it that way, of mostly interviews, but I thought this was a special moment, and this is a special thing that I've done, so I kind of want to share the learnings with you in case this is something you might enjoy doing yourself. So let's get right into it. L. Beecher, who runs a great walk here in Austin, asked on Twitter, what made you feel called to take this retreat? And it's a great question, and it was just something that was in the back of my head where I was like, I know that I did this retreat, a similar retreat, which I'll link down below, my learnings from that one in 2020, in the beginning of August. And I learned so much about myself. I felt like a new person. And that retreat birthed the podcast. I did the retreat in August of 2020 and started the podcast in September of 2020. So if you look at the one thing that has stayed true for my life in the longest period of time, it was definitely going on that, doing the podcast, and the retreat is the reason why the podcast exists in some sense. And so it just made me so clear focused on what direction I wanted to head in my life. And that got me so excited. So I figured if I did it then, I should probably do it again, and that might help lead me to the direction that I wanted to go. And so I felt called because I saw August coming up on the calendar. I saw that I'd done it in the past at that time. And I said, I got to do this again. So that's why I felt called to take the retreat this time. And immediately, it was something that I know that I have to bake this in every 6 months because of the learnings and the lessons for at least 3 days. But we'll get further into that. Bryant Ferrate asks, who runs a great podcast, link down below. You should check that one out. He asks, what is the greatest difference in this trip compared to the first one? And the answer to this is that I'm not necessarily seeking what's next. I wasn't trying to learn more about myself like I was in the first retreat. In the first retreat, I was really trying to figure out the direction and where I was headed. And in this one, I know the direction, I know where I'm headed, but I think the subtle refinements, the tweaks, I was wondering what would pop up if I know where I'm headed. So that's kind of the major difference. So let's get into what did I learn, and what was the question that I jotted down right before going into the retreat. And there were 3 questions that I really wanted to tackle, and that I won't necessarily give you the answers to what my answers were to these questions, but this was how I was framing the entire retreat with these beginning questions. And on that point, I feel like podcasts and interview podcasts, they're framed in the first 5-10 minutes, and that's going to set the direction for where you're going. So similarly, these were the questions that I was thinking about as I was going into the retreat. The first one was, what do you want in the future? Physical things, lifestyle things, emotional things, goals, and experiences. So I was going through those and thinking about which physical things I want, which lifestyle ways of being did I want, what emotions did I want to experience more often, what goals did I have, and what experiences did I want to check off. Another question similar to that is, what's on your bucket list? And then the last question was, when you die, what do you want to have accomplished? I really liked those questions. They gave me something to think about. I jotted that down into a notebook. And then I brought a bunch of books as well. So I think I had 10 different books and options for books. I only ended up reading 3 of them, and we're going to cover 2 of them in this podcast. So what was crazy to me about this experience was that immediately, like in the first 3 hours or 6 hours of unplugging, I had the following thoughts that they just like poured out of me, which was so exciting because I was like, oh, if this is just these thoughts that were in me, they came out right away. Like maybe the answer for people isn't to just take like 4 days to do this. Maybe it's just to take one day, one night. I do think that you get more benefit the longer you do this without the phone, without the laptop, all of it. But yeah, I mean, these were the immediate thoughts that I had. The first was, I need to get my nutrition dialed in. And the reason for that is it's one thing you can absolutely control. You control what you put into your mouth. And when you do that, you take ownership and then you appreciate life more if you're eating in the right way. It's the one way in which your thoughts can create actions. And if you align those thoughts and actions with, I want to be eating foods that make me feel great and that are nutritious and that are helpful to my long-term goals, like it's hard for me to imagine somebody that's eating right or eating in a way that is in alignment with who they want to be if they're going to look back on their life and be upset with that. So that was one thing that really stood out, was like, get my nutrition dialed in. Another thing that popped up immediately is like, I need to get better at keeping the promises that I make, or when I say something, actually executing on them. And it's one area where I feel like I can do a better job at. Another thing that popped up, I need to clean up my living area. The place that I'm living in and working in should be looking good. And yeah, it's one thing that popped up almost immediately. Another is like about the podcast. I was like, damn, like I thought I'd be further along after 3 years. But then I thought, wow, like we're actually doing 40 to 50,000 downloads a month. The podcast is just crossed the 1 million play mark, and it's going pretty well. Now the question becomes like, how do you 10x that? How do you go from 40 to 50,000 downloads a month to 400 to 500,000 downloads per month? And for me, it was like, you got to turn pro. Turning pro is a concept from Steven Pressfield. He wrote a great book, which I've read twice, called Turning Pro, which just talks about the idea that there's a difference between the amateur and the professional. And although I feel as if I've made strides to be a professional, like it's another level of consistency, of focus, of professionalism for marketing the podcast. And so I really want to take strides to turn pro for this podcast, and Monday, Wednesday, Friday, not miss a day. The last thing that came to mind for this retreat that came to mind immediately for the retreat, is I have to find a way to make money that is in alignment with my soul and is scalable. And so for me, I had some good ideas around that, but one thing that came to mind slightly after and before was around building a course around interviewing. And so I will be putting out a course on interviewing coming very soon. I do not want to give a specific launch date, but it could be in the next week. It could be in the next month. It's coming along very solidly. And I'm excited with making it. And there's a lot of stuff on interviewing that is very close to my heart and that I think more people could benefit if they would apply some of the lessons that I've learned from doing it 400 times. So yeah, stay tuned for that. That course will be, I think there will be a lot of information in that course that I've spent thousands of hours listening to podcasts. I've spent thousands of hours preparing for my own over the past 3 years. So I think it will be very valuable, and it will be a very valuable way for me to make money and continue to scale up the operations on this podcast to get these questions and these insights into more hearts. So very excited about that. So the two books that I read, or that I enjoyed enough to cover on this episode, was 3 Simple Steps by Trevor Blake. 3 Simple Steps. Trevor Blake will be coming on the podcast sometime in the next month. And he sold, let me just read the back of the book. Since 2001, I have built 4 different companies, starting each with a few $100s. My first sold for $107 million, and I had similar success selling my second company in 2011. I know what it takes to achieve professional, financial, and personal goals. I have no identifiable skill or talent. I come from a poor background with as many hangups as anyone else. I know family or business connections to help me. I have, however, studied the attributes, talents, and insights of self-made men and women. From their successes, I formed 3 rules and have lived them consistently for 20 years. They have turned an ordinary life into extraordinary. And so I'm going to break down the 3 simple steps because they're so wise. And I highly recommend reading this book for the stories and the insights. What I'm about to cover is not extensive by any means, but there's a lot of wisdom in this book, and I highly recommend it. I've read it now 2 or 3 times, and every time I learn something new. And I'll probably read it another time before Trevor actually comes onto the podcast. So the first, step 1, this is from 3 Simple Steps. The first step is to master your mentality. And the key theme for this book is to be for things, not against them. He uses the example of Mother Teresa, and Mother Teresa was for peace. She wasn't against war. She was for peace. And if you just think about that truth, like, are you for creating the life you want or against someone else? And being for things and not against them is the core of his beliefs. He also talks about the importance of avoiding media or negative media, things that are going to bring you down. And so thank you for listening to this and not believing this to be some negative media. He also talks about starting each day by saying, I am, insert your name, and today was a fantastic day. So I am Danny Miranda, and today was a fantastic day. I think part of his strategies are about looking at it in the reverse, looking at it, assuming what you want is already done. And then he's also got this interesting concept called an invisible mentality shield. This is just like, a mentality shield would be like, there are going to be negative forces potentially that come into your day. How do you not let those become a part of you? What Trevor Blake talks about is the importance of wearing this mentality shield. Step 2 is the importance of taking quiet time. And this starts with a formal declaration. And so I actually wrote this out and I signed it. And the formal declaration that he has in the book is, I, Danny Miranda, from this day forward, take full control of my mentality. I accept full responsibility and accountability for my experiences. I intend abundance to flow into my life. I commit to change all patterns of destructive behavior and to consistently introduce whatever it takes to succeed. So that's the formal declaration. I wrote it out, I signed it, and then an important part of step 2, taking quiet time, is to spend 20 minutes by yourself every day. Basically meditate, but I love how he approaches it with like, it's not, you don't have to call it meditation. You can just spend 20 minutes by yourself every day and spend time in nature. So an important piece of that is to schedule in time into your calendar to take a meeting in nature, like a meeting with yourself just there. And so I found that really cool. That's not advice you'll hear a lot. Maybe it is advice you'll hear a lot, but it's not necessarily advice that people that I've seen a lot of people do. Like actually put in their calendar, all right, I'm going to spend an hour in nature today. Like that's such a cool concept that Trevor talks about, part of the reason for why he sold 2 different companies for over $100 million. And then the third step that he talks about in this book is setting intentions. He says, there's a magic to thinking big. Details make your intentions feel more familiar. Speak out your intentions in nature. And don't tell anyone your intentions. And so I've historically in the past been very open about what I aim to achieve. And if you've listened to this podcast, you might know that I'm trying to sell out Madison Square Garden for a live podcast with 19,763 people. But moving forward, I'm going to test out his theory, his idea of not telling people about my intentions and seeing what that leads to, if that leads to anything better. So that was one thing that I spent a lot of time doing on this retreat, is setting intention, setting the vision for where I would like to see myself end up and what I would like to see myself doing on the day-to-day. And so the conclusion of all this, of the book in a line is: be selective with your media, avoid complainers, treat yourself to quiet time and stillness, and write your intentions daily. So even though you can get the full thing in one line, I still highly, highly recommend the book, because you'll get the stories and the insights and the ways that Trevor has actually applied this in his own life. And the practical change that I made after doing this was I took the intentions that I wrote out after the retreat and I spoke them aloud into my phone, into the voice memos app. And after that, I just started listening to them every day and listening to the intentions that I've set forth. And it just is a great way to increase my vibrational state and be in a better mood, is to just have these intentions and live in the intentions and just hear myself speak them over myself often. I really enjoy it. And I recommend doing things, having these intentions in past tense, but mixing in things that are already true about your life that you love with things that you don't have access to in your life currently. And doing these two will kind of trip your brain up and not knowing which is real and which isn't. And likely will assume they're all real, which means they eventually might all really become real. So I'm excited to see how that plays out. I'm very new to that practice, and so I can't necessarily recommend it, but that is what I'm doing, and it seems to have lit a fire under me that's really exciting. The other book that I read I read both these, is The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks. And the big takeaway, and the 2 big takeaways that I had from this book, is what is stopping you from feeling absolutely amazing in the present moment? And the second one was, are we the first generation to understand what it feels like to have a life that is going positively and is excited and things are going well? Are we the people who are learning how to live feeling good? And I just found that to be an interesting concept. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but that just came through me. And that got me so excited. It's like, if we are the first people to learn how to live well, what does that mean? And how do we do that most effectively? And the story that really hit home for me was Gay was sitting there in his desk while his child was at camp, and he was imagining his child, like, he was having a great day and everything was going well, and then he was like what happens if something bad happens to my child? And so he calls the camp and he's like, is everything all right with my daughter? And they assure him, like, yeah, like, everything's good. And, like, by the way, you're the 20th person to call this summer. And he's like, oh, wow, that's interesting. And he realized in that moment that he had an upper limit problem, meaning his upper limit for the amount of joy that he could experience in any given moment was X. Let's call it X. Not necessarily Twitter, but let's just call it X for the sake of this exercise. And so he's like, all right, the most joy that I can experience is this. And whenever I hit that limit, I'm then going to do something, think something to make myself feel bad. And yeah, think about this through your own life. Like, if everything's going well, do you manufacture drama in a business or a relationship? If you're just like, if 10 things are going right, do you just assume it's going to be bad the next thing? And so this upper limit problem is something I've heard about, talked about in the past, but it just brought it back up. And it was really exciting to think about that concept, particularly as it relates to being a generation that can feel good. And yeah, it's worth considering. Where do you think you have an upper limit problem? Where are you talking badly about yourself? Where are you purposely feeling poorly? Because what's stopping you from feeling amazing in the present moment because you're alive? Like, imagine if you treated yourself like a baby. Like, we look at a baby and we're like, oh my God, this is a human being. This so much potential. There's so much here. What if we treated ourselves like that? Because what's the difference between 6-month-old you, 28-year-old you, 21-year-old you, like 40-year-old you, 80-year-old you? There's so much potential in you. And if we can treat ourselves like children, like really small children, where we have such optimism and hope and appreciation for that, it's like, you are no different than that. So yeah, the upper limit problem is something to think about in your own life. And how can you feel a little more joy and appreciation and excitement? Another thing that I realized from doing this retreat, not necessarily from the Big Leap, is this concept of the more you do, the easier it gets. If you clean the dishes, you have now more space to clean other dishes. If you do 100 podcasts, it's easier to do the 101st podcast because you have the systems in place. You have now networks that open up to you from other guests. If you go running, you run 100 times. It's easier the 101st time you do it because you have better lung capacity. This is true for cold plunging, lifting weights. It doesn't matter. Whatever you do, the more you do of it, it genuinely does get easier. So that's something to keep in mind. And that's something that popped up for me at the end of the retreat. One of the last things that came to me is like, a lot more people are going to do this. And this is needed now more than ever, particularly if you're someone who is in technology for a lot of your day. A lot of my day is responding to people on Twitter, talking to podcast guests, trying to book podcast guests. And so because of that, this fully immersion in the online world, it's like, I got to take a step out. I got to take my quiet time. I got to schedule time in nature. I got to meditate. Because if I do that, everything else will be better. But also, like, this is because more and more people are getting sucked into the amazing world that is technology. It will be more needed for people to take breaks like the one that I took. And so, yeah, I think this is going to be a big business that pops up is people doing retreats like this. And I also think it's like, it's good for your soul. Like it feels differently 2 days of doing this. Another practical takeaway that came out of it was that moving forward, I'm going to be doing no phone Saturdays. So on Saturdays, I'm not going to be using my phone or laptop to the best of my abilities. And I did this last Saturday for the first time, and there's a different energy. There's a different feeling. And I start taking around a notepad more often, and I'm starting to think about like each thought that comes in. I noticed how often I was distracted by different tabs, and doing this retreat allowed me to really jot down and note all the thoughts and get comfortable with boredom. And it's not, for me, it wasn't just about doing the retreat. Now, like, how do you make it a part of my life? How do I make it part of my life? And the answer to that is doing something like a no phone Saturday. And I'm excited to see how that experiment unfolds. The last thing that I'll say is that I came out of the retreat, and the first thing I saw on my phone when I opened up Instagram was a friend of mine who almost died. And this was like a 25-year-old who had been hospitalized for the past week, was in a coma of some sort for 24 hours at least, and it looked like it was possible that he wasn't going to be around anymore. And this was someone that I've taken a run with in the past, and I'll link down his podcast down below if you're interested. But it really made me think about like the shortness of life, about how even if somebody you interact with is healthy, you assume they're going to live for 80, 90 years. Maybe you assume that about yourself. Maybe you assume that about a parent or a loved one. It's like, oh no, they've got, a long time left. You don't know. And seeing that as the first post that came out when I came out of the retreat, I was blown away that someone who I was friends with, who I thought would be around forever, like had a freak accident occur. So yeah, just there's an appreciation for life that you really sense when you sit with nothingness. And yeah, I'm really grateful for taking the time to do nothing, have no phone, have no laptop, have no connection to the outside world. And I highly recommend it. If you can't do it for 4 days, do it for 1 day. Like, do it for a single day. Like, don't use your phone or laptop for a day or for 2. See what happens. Maybe you don't even have to go away. But can you just put it down? Can you put the connection down? I'm so appreciative and I'm so grateful for people listening to this podcast. But I'm even more appreciative and even more grateful when people stop listening to the podcast and start listening to themselves. That's why I do this. So we can greater understand ourselves. That's why I ask the questions. That's why I research people. So I can really understand what makes them them. So they could really understand what makes them them, so that they can go throughout their lives with a little bit of a more understanding of what quote unquote value they bring. And I just hope you take the opportunity to go inward, to understand yourself, to face the things that you quote unquote know you should be doing and actually do them. Because life is short, but it's not meaningless. It's very meaningful. And the things you do have an impact, and they do matter. And I'm really grateful for you listening, for you taking the time out of your day. And if you have any questions about going on a cabin retreat like this, spending some time away from technology, go ahead, send me a message, send me a tweet, or an X at Hey Danny Miranda, or drop a comment down below on YouTube. That's it. Subscribe, follow the podcast, share it with somebody you think would enjoy it and would enjoy going on a retreat. And until the next one, see you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and be well. Peace.